Good?
Good.
All right, so I got a question. First question was submitted in our new system, and I thought I'd address it. And the question is, what is the difference between exclusive devotion and religious extremism, fundamentalism? And it's a good question given the appalling manifestations of religious extremism we experience in the world today. And it's also a good question in that the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of our main texts, of course, advocates exclusive devotion. Throughout the Gita, that idea is repeated. It's the theme that's repeated throughout the book in different places, which is one of the ways by which we determine what a book is about. We look at the beginning, we look at the end, the introduction, the conclusion. There should be some correspondence. What's repeated throughout is another element, if you will, in determining the essence of the text. So there are other criterion also this is from ancient times, the way to understand the text. But again, occurring throughout and with different words. Ananya bhakti, ananya, no other, is an example that this term is used. At the conclusion of the Gita, we find this, of course, in what's one of the more famous verses of the Gita, Sarvadharman Prityaja Mam Ekam Sharanam Vrajam. Only me, Krishna says. Take shelter only of me. So there is a strong advocacy and emphasis on exclusive devotion on the part of Krishna speaking in the Gita. In the Bhagavatam, of course, theological sequel to the Gita, the same thing, exclusive devotion. So we could talk about it in relation to our particular tradition, the Bhakti tradition, and we could talk about it, I suppose, in a broader sense. And I think to start there might be good. In the broader sense, I think that exclusive devotion, and here I don't necessarily mean bhakti, but dedication, and there's a difference, of course. Bhakti is otherworldly. Bhakti, as we know from the commentaries of the Goswamis, Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Shijiva Goswami, and from amongst the founding acharyas, that bhakti is constituted of Krishna's internal energy, or his Swarup Shakti. So it's the power, the influence, the engine that drives the Leela, and the Maya Shakti is the engine driving the karmic realm. Bhakti, therefore, is more than our effort. We have to apply ourselves in relation to the opportunity that presents itself, which is an act of grace. And it presents itself as an opportunity, and it's a structured opportunity. In other words, it's constituted of something. What is bhakti? What is not bhakti? And here we're talking about the term used by Rupa Goswami in where he defines bhakti in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, Uttam Bhakti. In the Gita we find different types, shades of bhakti and so forth, but the advocacy is Ananya Bhakti or Uttam Bhakti, same idea, exclusive devotion, and to Krishna, or the different, avatars of Krishna, manifestations of Krishna. And it's made up of certain angas, the body of bhakti, certain limbs, hearing, chanting, meditating on Vishnu, and so on and so forth. So it's something very specific, and not just the general idea of dedication. You have to be dedicated to accomplish anything. That's true. You have to put some effort into it. And we have to put some effort into bhakti. When Rupa Goswami defines bhakti, anyabhilashita shunyam, gyan karmadi anavritam, anukulena krishnanu shilam, bhakti rutam. He describes it as anukulena krishnanu shilam, an ongoing culture of acts and the emotions that arise out of them that are pleasing to Krishna, favorable to him. So that it's an ongoing culture means that the will that the jiva, to some extent, is constituted of, is unit of, has to express itself in relation to the opportunity that presents itself. In other words, the grace of the Godhead's reaching out to us, and he does so, of course, through his devotees, who are considered manifestations of his compassion, his Kripa Shakti, so on. So there's some difference here between the general idea of dedication, which especially means you have to put your effort into it, and you have to pay attention and so forth to be successful in any particular field. So with regard to different paths that aren't the paths of bhakti but are religious paths, of course there are a number of them, and at the same time, I think that the heart of them, if you will, is very similar, or let's say that there's considerable common ground between them, and here I'm referring to religious paths or spiritual traditions that, to use a term I often invoke, are ego-effacing. That on the one side, at least, are focused on eradicating the small-mindedness and the exploitive tendencies within us that constitute kind of the call of the sense objects for our attention, time, energy, focus, in such a way that our life becomes defined by answering that call. So to step back from that and starve out, if you will, this exploitive taking ego, the taking tendency in us. And this is the kind of the baseline of mystic experience in all the world's great spiritual traditions. And religious or spiritual experience, when we speak about that, we're speaking about moving beyond that conventional egoic sense of self. And so then, of course, there are many people that speak about religious experiences with no idea of this ego-effacingness that we're talking about and so forth. But in those claims a religious experience, we do not find the kind of common ground that we find amongst the mystics of the various traditions. And so that's why a lot of people think one religion says this, another religion says that. God told me to do this. God told me to kill the Christians, and maybe God told me to kill the Muslims, or these types of things. So that kind of is where we draw the line ourselves, at least. I think it's reasonable, between genuine spiritual experience and often our imagination, which manifests in such ways that it goes against the very heart of sacred texts, like you take the Christian text of the Bible, love your neighbor like yourself. Well, that's there you go, right there, and that's supposed to be one of and your God, the God with your heart and soul, something like these two are the laws of the New Testament, replacing the laws of the Old Testament, replacing them by way, I would imagine, because if you love your neighbor like yourself, you're not going to steal from your neighbor, you're not going to covet your neighbor's wife, or kill, or so forth, which is means that the Ten Commandments are fulfilled by these two and something more. So there's an example in that tradition, and so this is the kind of common ground we find in different religious traditions, out of which there are few but enough mystics to get some real sense of the basic idea of religious experience. And so there are different spiritual traditions, and amongst these spiritual traditions, I believe, each of the founders, the Buddha, for example, the Christ, the Shankar amongst the monists, Ramanuja amongst the Vaishnavas, we're speaking of Krishna and Chaitanya Bhakti tradition of ourselves, you do find an emphasis on exclusive dedication and commitment. Again, I'm differentiating this from bhakti when I say commitment, dedication, but exclusive dedication to the path. And I think that is understandable, because if we find a certain tradition and path attractive, how can we expect to be successful in pursuing the path unless we pay attention to it and commit ourselves to it? And it's, after all, speaking about the greatest accomplishment. It's almost a non-accomplishment because we already are, from the mystical perspective, the units of Satchidananda, and realize what we are. When you come to bhakti, there's something more. But at any rate, it's a great challenge, right? It's the greatest adventure, if you will. It's to change your whole angle of vision from being a taker to being a non-taker and ultimately a giver in the bhakti traditions. So each of the paths advocate, if you're going to be on this path, then you should pay attention to it, and as if it is the best path, which would be the natural conclusion of anyone who chose the path. That for me, and this is the key caveat, I guess, this is the best path for me. And so with that spirit in mind, we can embark upon a path, feel it is the best, give exclusive devotion to it, but when we say it's the best path for me, we may acknowledge that there may be other paths that are better for others. And so in this simple sense in which I'm talking about it, broader sense, it seems reasonable that exclusive commitment to a path is understandable, natural, to be expected. And at the same time, it does not have to, that expectation and that advocacy does not constitute religious extremism and fanaticism. The difference being that exclusive devotion to a path that constitutes religious extremism and fanaticism is one that does not acknowledge that there are other paths for others. So it's in the name of exclusive devotion to a particular path, it's at war often with other paths. And it's unfortunate that, I guess it would be interesting to note that between the Western, for example, Abrahamic traditions and the Eastern traditions, one of the basic differences is this sense of exclusivity and inclusivity. So, inclusiveness. So the Eastern paths tend to be more inclusive by their very nature, and the Abrahamic traditions tend to be more exclusive. Not that there aren't fanatics in the East and West alike, no doubt. There are, but if we look at the core of the paths, I think that's maybe perhaps a fair assessment. So, exclusive devotion to a dedication, let's say, to a path that is applied in such a way that it does not dismiss the other paths and the experience of others, as opposed to exclusive devotion to a path that does not see any other viable path, and even is at war with them, is kind of a basic divide. In our Vaishnava tradition, our Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, we know that Bhaktivinoda made a statement and invoked a term, Saragrahi Vaishnav, Saragrahi and Barabahi. So Barabahi means literally who carries a heavy load. And Saragrahi means who's an essence seeker. And so his idea was that there are those identified with a particular spiritual tradition that in their commitment to it and identification to it, they're not able to identify with the essence, but more or mostly with the externals that are different from other paths. And as a result, they don't see the value in other paths, whereas the Saragrahi that he himself exemplified is perhaps nicely described by his own statement when he said that when I go into a different temple or church or chapel, what may be the good case, in a different tradition, and I see worship there, I think, oh, they're worshiping him this way here. How interesting. He's accepting praise, whatnot, and sincere approach on the part of the practitioners in different ways, in different places, appearing in different cultures, and so on and so forth. So this is the Saragrahi Vaishnava idea. So at the same time, we find statements of Bhaktivinoda that are very extreme, like anyone who's not a servant of Radha, I don't want to see his face, something like that. So this is then exclusive devotion on the very, and this is in the context of bhakti itself, on a very high end. And this is a kind of moment of bhava and exclusivity, for example, of Radha's handmaidens and their dedication to her over the opposition party in the Leela of Chandravali and so forth. So you can't take a statement like that as Bhaktivinoda and voice it without those types of transcendental emotions, insight, and experience, and so forth, and be saying the same thing that he is, as some people may do in the name of exclusive devotion and and use such an expression to be at odds with other traditions. Now, we have differences in different mystical traditions, that's very, very clear. But we do acknowledge that ego-effacing traditions have some efficacy. At the same time, we, following the sacred text, the revelation of the Hindus, and considering the Bhagavatam for good reason to be the essence of that, we do find there a number of statements as to the effect that without bhakti, and this is, again, more than just dedication or commitment to a particular path, without bhakti herself, being involved in the path, there is no, the path will not be efficacious in terms of affording one a permanent standing beyond the realm of karmic bondage. But then we should break that down a bit, and what it means is that entering that side, if you will, to the realm of love from the realm of exploitation requires an invite. You kind of go and bang down the door there, enter there, as I say sometimes with your shoes on. It requires an invitation. Grace. So that's the broader type of application, interpretation of the idea that bhakti is required. For example, the sattviki bhakti manifesting within the sattva guna. It's not uttam bhakti, but that kind of bhakti in relation to the path of knowledge, jnana, will result in attaining its goal. But Ananya Bhakti in Uttam Bhakti in our particular tradition, of course, in reference to the Gita, as I did, which I cited earlier, Sarvadharman Prityaja Mamekam Sharanam Braja, where he says, only me, we have to look and see what he's talking about. The context is that there are, in Hinduism, of course, many gods and goddesses, which are all in one sense, ways of talking about nature, the natural world, in terms of the fact that consciousness is behind nature, drives nature, and so powerful, as it is in our case, units of consciousness are driving matter. We have causal efficacy, so in a larger sense, movements of nature, it all has consciousness behind it, and so the gods and the goddesses idea. This is, of course, all speaking about psychic matter, the realm of the gods and goddesses, where there are possibilities that we don't find in the realm of physical matter. But the general idea of dharma or religion in Hinduism is to acknowledge these different gods in pursuit of different types of material betterment, improvement, acquisition, and so forth. So the gods and goddesses themselves are part of the fabric of nature, and their power to bestow is limited to the bestowal of the bounty of nature, material fruits and results. Krishna, on the other hand, is not a product of nature, but nature is a product of Krishna, as explained in the Gita. In other words, there is a Godhead, if you will. And so the advocacy in the Gita is to be, if you want spiritual, experiential life rather than just religious life in pursuit of material betterment, material acquisition, and so on and so forth, and forego the others and exclusively dedicate yourself to me. Me, of course, could also mean Ram, Narayan. Krishna's tu Bhagavan Swayam, so he's speaking, and then all the different manifestations of himself are within himself. And this corresponds with Rupa Goswami's definition of bhakti, Amyabhilashika Sunyam Gyanaka Marina Vidam Anukulena Krishna Anushilanam. When it says Krishna Anushilanam, it means Krishna, Narayan, Varaha, Nisringa, and all the Vishnu avatars and so forth. But this is the idea of exclusive devotion in the Gita. It means to take up bhakti herself as being presented in the Gita, and forego the path of dharma that involves no more than material acquisition, material improvement, material betterment, and so forth. And as you can see, as we're talking about it, the devotion to Krishna, who transcends, if you will, material nature, and at the same time is the material nature, and that is his Shakti. Devotion to him includes, if you will, devotion to the gods and goddesses, such that it is mentioned in the Bhagavatam, one who becomes a devotee of Vishnu, all the gods and goddesses, it means all that they could possibly bestow is at such a person's disposal. But such a person is not interested in them. So, while it's speaking about exclusive devotion to Krishna, properly understood, exclusive devotion to Krishna includes devotion to the gods and goddesses, and there are good examples of it in the Leela as well, of course. We find the gopis worshipping Katyayani, for example. All the different gods and goddesses, all the different are different names for their names are different names for Krishna. So they are thought to be some kind of partial manifestation of himself. Thus, worshipping him directly is also worship them. They celebrate such worship, such devotion, and all that they could possibly, as I say, bestow, and more, is at the disposal of such a devotee. So even while he's saying exclusive devotion to me, we can see it's inclusive. If you worship one god in Hinduism or another god, then you can worship one and the other might be envious. We see examples of this in the Bhagavatam. But exclusive, of course, there are examples of exclusive devotion to Krishna that make some of the gods upset too, but they become upset because Muyanti Atsuraya, as the Bhagavatam says at its onset. Who Krishna is bewildering even to the gods, but in Bhagavatam, where these examples are given, like the Brahma Vimohan Leela, like the Govardhan Leela, where Indra becomes bewildered and so forth, the gods become enlightened as to who Krishna is as well. They serve as vehicles to explain the position of Krishna to us. There's a real nice example in the Prahlad Nrsimha Leela, where Nrsimha makes his appearance and all the gods and goddesses appear and acknowledge the extraordinary position of Nrsimha and of Prahlad in relation to him, who could pacify him in which none of the gods or goddesses could do, representing something less than bhakti and exclusive devotion themselves. So, at any rate, exclusive devotion to Krishna in the context, for example, of the Gita and the Bhagavatam, is inclusive at the same time with regard to the particular statement, Sarvadharman Pratyajamam Ekam Sharanam. Give up the path of worship of the gods and goddesses for material acquisition and exercise exclusive devotion to myself. Then, of course, there's bhakti in relation to gyan and in relation to yoga and so forth. These are transcendental paths. The worship of the gods and goddesses is under the Rajaguna, the karma marg. Gyan and yoga seek transcendence. Now, according to the Bhagavatam, they require some element of bhakti in order to be efficacious. They are genuine transcendental paths. For us, who are cultivating exclusive devotion to Sri Krishna, we acknowledge them as such, and persons may take to them because of having met a sadhu of the yogic tradition or of the Gyan tradition and have samskar for it, and they may have such a samskar. They're now preoccupied with attaining Brahmasayuja, with attaining, say, the optimum of Shantarasa through Ashtanga Yoga and so forth. Our position should be, there are people that do that. And these are different faces of the Godhead. Brahmeti, Paramatmeti, Bhagavaniti Shabdate. At the same time, of course, we share our tradition when the opportunity presents itself, and even sharing what bhakti is about is a form of kirtan, so it helps us. It is bhakti itself, so we see Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and shared his bhakti with others and taught it and so on and so forth. So we can make our case and create bhakti samskars, and there's a possibility that someone might, from the yoga marg or gyan marg, come to the bhakti marg. But we don't have, our teaching is not that if they don't come to Ananya Bhakti, everything is lost. That's not the teaching. Brahmeti, Paramatmeti, Bhagavaniti Shabdate. These are real faces of the Absolute, and they are transcendental. Paramatma, in Vaikuntha, as Bhagavan Narayan, they're from whom the avatars are coming, Mahavishnu and so forth, the beginning of the Paramatma. Mahavishnu is the first manifestation of the Paramatma, which is the compassionate heart of Narayan. As we've explained, when Narayan wants to experience compassion, there needs to be a world for that. It can't be Vaikuntha. No one needs mukti there. So Mahavishnu is in one sense the compassionate heart of Narayan, and then there's a world in which he doesn't want to be alone, so he becomes many, and then the many are small, and the jurisdiction that he has over material nature is such that he can digest, but they cannot, and so further avatar, further descent. He's the original avatar. Krishna is the avatari. Mahavishnu is the original avatar, and the avatars, different faces of Narayan, are coming through him, showing compassion and so forth. And there you have it also, of course, within Vishnu Bhakti. There's Narayan Bhakti, there's Ram Bhakti, there's Sringa Bhakti. Even within Gaudiya Bhakti, there's Vatsalya Bhakti, there's Madhurya Bhakti Rasa, Sakya Bhakti Rasa, differences and so on and so forth. And while we're exclusively dedicated in the optimum with the Sthayi Bhav for one type of love of Krishna, certainly we honor others. So it's very unbecoming when, for example, we find this, sometimes we see in Gaudiya Vaishnava an advocacy of Manjari Bhava, which is the highest advocacy of the ideal of the prayojan of Gaudiya Vaishnavism, but when it's used in a way to beat others over the head, who may be influenced otherwise, even in the context of bhakti, it's very unbecoming. This is where, in the name of in the name of exclusive devotion, you find extremism, religious extremism, and some fighting over, and so on and so forth. So you can mouth the words of your guru, or, for example, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who's I cited strong type of statements about dedication to Radha and so forth. But if it's just used to fight with other people, that's not what Bhaktivinoda Thakur was doing at all, right? So, but anyway, even on a lower level, let's just say there is Bhagawan, and all that includes, from Shantarasa to Madhurya Rasa, and within Madhurya Rasa to Parakiya, within that to the servitude of Radha and so forth, and then there is the Paramatma. Well, we could say Paramatma, Vaikuntha, and Brahman. These are real faces of the Absolute, and they're real and really perceived, experienced, entered into by different paths, and those paths are there in the sacred text. Astanga Yoga is there in the Bhagavad Gita in the 6th chapter. Again, in the 8th chapter. Right? The advocacy as such, it's mixed with bhakti, but so are the Yoga Sutras. When Ishvar Pranidhan is repeatedly mentioned, submission to the Ishvar, to the Godhead, and the Gyan Marg. So these are real paths to real transcendental goals. Granted, they need little bhakti, but they aren't all paths of Uttam Bhakti. We may feel, in some sense, it's too bad from our perspective that they had to enter into Brahman when they could have entered into Prem Bhakti, which is one tiny atomic particle of which is more blissful than all of Brahman combined. These are statements of advocacy of our path of Bhakti, but it is hard to quantify infinite bliss and multiply it, and so forth. But it is indeed speaking about greater possibilities of intimacy with that which, for example, Brahman is. Brahman is the what's the opposite of concentrated? Diluted. The diluted form of Satchidananda. Krishna is the concentrated form of Satchidananda. We may feel some regret in some sense, but I think that someone who has deep experience of what Chaitanya Mahaprabhu offers, like Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, they said that he couldn't tolerate the idea that people would get less than what Chaitanya Mahaprabhu came to give. So he made a strong advocacy. But from those deep experiences and so forth, I think we can make statements that may seem like religious extremism, but did not play out in that way in the person of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, or in the person of Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So it's a problem. It's a problem in the world, religious extremism. It's a problem in Gaudiya Vaishnavism. It may take a slightly different shape. Our members are not involved, as far as I know, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, suicide bombing, but they do engage in terrorism. Often within the community itself, and with others outside of the community, and it's more of a mental harassment and abuse and so forth. But it's definitely terrifying. It's unfriendly. It's uncomfortable. It's not thought out and so forth. There was a comic that I saw. Some of you may have seen it not long ago. It was an alien spaceship, like a flying saucer, and a couple of aliens, if you want to. I mean, that's so weird from the Earth's perspective. Aliens, and they're talking with one another, and there's some smoke and whatnot on Earth, and one says to the other one, they're fighting about which religion is more peaceful. Something like that. They're fighting over which religion is more peaceful. So this is the idea, right, of terrorism, which causes people not to be interested in religion at all, and we find it also in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and it's very unbecoming when it is expressed in the way that I just mentioned, that my rasa is the highest. My guru emphasized the Manjari Bhav. This is what the scriptures emphasize, and if you're not taking that up, you're a real loser. You're getting in the way. You should be. And we've heard things like this. We admit it is the highest ideal. But I've given an example before. When someone like a Vaidhi Bhakta like Narada Muni comes to Vrindavan, the gopis don't say, "Oh, some Vaidhi Bhakta is here. Poor guy. See if we can convert him to Braj Bhakti," or Uddhava who came and spoke to them. They have regard for them. It's the standard of Vrindavan. Who has exclusive devotion to Krishna. Mahaprabhu, this is another example. Mahaprabhu advocates exclusive devotion to Krishna Nam Sankirtan, and what does he say is required for that exclusive devotion? Exclusive devotion for Chaitanya Mahaprabhu is expressed in Shikshastakam in the words what? Who knows? Well, that's part of it, but where does he say exclusive devotion? Kirtana Yasada Hari, the end of the verse that you cited. Kirtana Yasada Hari. This is like fixed, right? Always chant. You don't have time for anything else. Time only for bhakti. And how we will get there? He says, Trinada Pisanichana, Tarada Pisanichana. He's a call for tolerance. A call for humility, for honoring others, expecting no honor for oneself. And indeed, as we really become exclusive members of Krishna Bhakti, exclusive and experiential members, we do honor people, and we tend to see some Krishna consciousness in everybody and honor them for that and gravitate towards that. And we see their dedication to something, another path, or to anything, and we think, if only I could apply the same effort to my bhakti. And that way we tend to honor them. This is the real experience. In other words, the experience of exclusive devotion is an inclusive experience. Prabhupada used to say, there's only Krishna consciousness. Like there's only, all shine comes from the sun. So, different shapes, different forms of it, and so on and so forth. Again, Vedānta-sūtra says, all the names of the gods and goddesses are names for Krishna. Mahaprabhu said every word in Sanskrit means Krishna. He has somehow explained like this to his students. He's seeing Krishna everywhere, especially in separation. It said in union there's one Krishna, in separation there's millions of Krishnas. One seeing him everywhere, in everything. Gopikas are honoring the trees, the earth, thinking that they have more devotion to Krishna than themselves. The trees are bending down a little bit by the burden of their branches, and from the gopis' view, in which their bhava is projected onto the trees, they think the trees have more devotion than us. They're not thinking, we are manjaris, you're only trees. How unfortunate for you. So, it's beautiful that the exclusive devotion is an inclusive experience, if you will, and it turns into such that everything is a teacher. Everything is speaking to me about how to be a better devotee. Everything is obviously animate and inanimate. The ingredients of the world has more bhakti than myself. So there's quite a difference anyway between religious extremism, religious fundamentalism, which is a problem in the world today, and the advocacy of exclusive devotion in general, as we spoke about, and the Ananya Bhakti, exclusive devotion of the Bhakti school itself. Any question? Yes.
What is the goal of karma yogis, karma yoga?
The goal of karma yoga. What is the goal of karma yoga? The goal of karma yoga is gyan. Because karma yoga, knowledge, mystic knowledge, knowledge in the true sense of the term, sattva. Karma is under the influence of rajas. Karma means the interaction in the world, and the reason we interact in the world is to acquire. Because there's the sense that I'm lacking, and that by acquisition I'll have more. I'll be more fulfilled. So karma is a karma yoga, karma path, let's say, is the path of dharma, is under the influence of Rajaguna. Now when you take the path of karma and turn it into karma yoga, what makes it yoga is that you take the acquisition out of it. Now you're doing karma, but not for acquisition. Previously you were doing karma, means you were, classically speaking, you were following the karma marg, worshipping the gods and goddesses because you wanted material fruits. Now you're doing the karma marg, but you're not interested in the fruits. And the fruits you're foregoing. You're doing the karmic marg, you're doing the duties, enjoined in the scripture, classically speaking, for your particular, to correspond with your particular psychophysiological makeup, because it's ordained in the scriptures and should be done and so forth, but you're not doing it in order to attain anything materially. And that factoring in that detachment, well, this is sattva then. Because in sattva gun, we're not in pursuit of material acquisition, because sattva guna brings knowledge. And knowledge culminates in the understanding of the difference between matter and spirit. Sattva is the intelligible aspect of nature. So what makes it intelligible, but what makes it knowable? There's something about nature that makes it knowable to a knower. Intelligibility. Material things have intelligibility. It's a kind of act, a non-action act. You understand? So everything that exists does something, even if it just has a way of making itself known. We call that sattva. And properly known and understood, and we also understand the self, and so we differentiate between consciousness and matter. This is sattva guna. So and then the path of gyan. So the path of karma yoga is aimed. It's a kind of it is the path of gyan, but in the beginning, because the Gita teaches you cannot just stop from you may not want the results of actions performed, but your tendency to perform the actions nonetheless is there as part of your psychological and physiological makeup. So go ahead and then perform them, but without attachment to the fruits. Knowledge will come, and then interest in those material propensities will also dissipate, and you then come to from active life to contemplative life in a natural way, in a healthy way. Otherwise, I can't just tell you, stop doing all these things, sit down and be a contemplative. But I can tell you, do the things that you do, but don't be attached to the fruits. Don't be preoccupied with the ups and downs of material life, the gains and losses. There will be gains, there will be losses. That's not why I'm living in the world, to avoid one and attain the other, but for knowledge of the self, experience of the self. So the goal of karma yoga is, it results in the ingress of mystic insight as to the nature of the self, because you're factoring the sattva in. Then sattva becomes prominent, and then the tendency to want to interact with the world and so forth is diminished. So classically speaking, the karma yogi is active in the world in a detached way, and the jnani is inactive and living a contemplative life. So there's a strong emphasis in the Gita on karma yoga because it's not easy to pursue the contemplative life. And if one tries to do it too soon, then they'll probably be unsuccessful. That's the goal of karma yoga. Now, there is karma yoga in which the fruits of one's work are offered to Vishnu. And that can culminate in Vaidhi Bhakti. You can't culminate in Rag Bhakti, which requires Mahat Kripa, the mercy of a Rag Bhakta. It's the only way. So there is, we say that pious works cannot give bhakti, that's true, but within the karma marg, even itself, there are some elements of bhakti. Worship of Vishnu is part of the karma marg also. We say that that's what makes it efficacious. And from that, one can get some footing in Vaidhi Bhakti. Jiva Goswami makes this point at the end of the second chapter of Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, where Raganuga Bhakti has been, Raganuga Sadhana has been explained. Does that help?
Yeah. So it's only so much ego-effacing as it leads to sattva or gyan, knowledge, karma yoga.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely ego-facing, because if you're interacting with the world, but you're not caught up in it, you're not taking the bait, so to speak. Now this same principle of moving from karma yoga to jnana is operative within bhakti. So external bhakti and internal bhakti. From external bhakti, which is active, internal bhakti will come. So just to sit down and try to do internal bhakti, well, that's probably a recipe for problems. Therefore, the emphasis of Bhakti Vinod, Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur, and the example of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu. His Madhya Lila, we talked about, and the significance of that, he's active. He's traveling, he's meeting with different leaders of society in different fields, and exemplifying, teaching bhakti, and so on and so forth. Public figure, kirtan, and after due course of this, his internal life comes on. It's an example. He's setting an example. And then the Antya Lila, in the later part, the last 12 years of the Antya Lila, he's fully preoccupied with internal life, which is a form of contemplative life. He wasn't preaching, he wasn't meeting with the public, involved in public sankirtan and so forth. So to forego the sankirtan, and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur gave a nice kind of, if you will, extended idea of kirtan. It's not very extended because in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu itself, who is the devotee who exemplifies the possibility of becoming perfect by kirtan? It's not Nard with his Veena? I'm joking. Right, it's Sukadev. People say, sometimes we hear this, that the problem is there's not enough kirtan. Too many classes, but not enough kirtan. The person who became perfect by kirtan was Sukadev. He wasn't doing public kirtan on the streets or anything of the sort. He was preaching the Bhagavatam. Parikshit Maharaj. So kirtan is the way. Now Mahaprabhu showed a certain type of kirtan in the public with sankirtan and so forth. That's true. But, he also did his kirtan in private, not on the streets. And for entering into that, he showed a way. And the way included teaching groups and often converting this person and that person. And his followers immediately, they opened temples, the Goswamis, they were busy with these things. Writing books, so on and so forth. So, in Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, this point was a strong emphasis of his. And he wrote a poem, Vaishnav K, who was a Vaishnav. And he was addressing his mind. My dear mind, what kind of Vaishnav for you? Tumi Kisha Vaishnav. You sit down in a solitary place just to imitate Haridas Thakur, but actually you're preoccupied with something other than the chanting. You can't even focus on the chanting steadily, and so forth. And at the end of it he says, Kirtana Prabhavi Smarana Svabhavi. The natural Svabhav, contemplation, meditation, mental absorption in one's Svabhav. Svabhav here means one's spiritual nature, Swarup. It will come by the power of Kirtan, Kirtana Prabhavi, by the power of Kirtan, Smarana Svabhavi. It will come naturally. And to sit down and forego the kirtan in this active life. Therefore Bhaktivinoda wanted to start a mission, active life, engage people, get them busy for bhakti. Hearing, chanting, shravanam, kirtanam, scrubbanam, mapanam. This type of thing. And by the force of this external bhakti, with a clear understanding theoretically of the goal and the ideal and where I am on the path and so forth, this will come. Capacity to enter into contemplative life. So, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur, he wrote this poem after having sat for how long? He took a vow to chant, was it 1 billion names?
Names, about 9 years.
9 years. 9 years of solitary bhajan. After 9 years of solitary, this is what he got up and wrote. So his preaching campaign came out of his bhajan, rather than a preaching campaign brought him to his bhajan, which was his advocacy. So what was his position? And thus the force of his kirtan. It was very powerful. The kirtan of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur sent waves throughout the Gaudiya and Hindu community. I mean, people opposed him, but because he was critiquing his own tradition, and he was very much an enemy of hypocrisy, especially in the name following Mahaprabhu and pursuing and experiencing the highest ideal and so forth. And he was novel in things that he implemented and innovated, his innovations and so forth. But this was with the blessing and encouragement of Bhaktivinoda Thakur, who wrote him to, letter told him to do these kind of things. That was like his Daiva Varnashram. Engage these Vaishnavas. Yes, they're all nirguna, but they all still have their propensities. Engage them according to their propensities within the context of bhakti. That's the idea. A novel idea of some type of Varnashram sensibilities within the context of bhakti. Let some people write the books. Some people will be carpenters, build the temples, masons, and so forth, according to their propensity. Some will be the householders, were the Vaishyas, because they generated the funds for the mission, and only sannyas, only to the Brahmins of his. Anyway, it's not the ordinary Vaishnava idea, but the point is that he created this type of mission, and we see there was opposition to him, and he was a very much known figure, and he was his kirtan was very powerful, and it's reached beyond the subcontinent of India, as we know. Here we all are because of that. So that kirtan, as I say, came out of the contemplative life. 9 years of exclusive bhajan, and then he thought, "What am I doing here? I should get up and do kirtan." I mean, his mind wasn't distracted. It's said that he, upon the completion of his vow, in the wind, a piece of paper blew in his vicinity, opened it up, and it had what I think it was the page from the Chaitanya Charitamrita with Mahaprabhu's instructions to Sanatana Goswami. Establish temples, establish the Vaishnava achar, behavior, write books on the teachings. What's the fourth thing? Excavate the places of Krishna's Leela and so forth. You can't just sit down to do all those things. Some of them you have to do there in broth writing. So anyway, so he became active with the mission and advocated a form of outreach that all was basically an engine of kirtan, this big drum, the printing press, and so forth, as a way to naturally enter into the contemplative life. So you see how it's a carryover from the ideas of karma, nishkam karma, to jnana, from active life in bhakti to inactive or external to internal life. So we should look for the progress in bhakti. It begins by Chaitanya Marjan. We should look for that. Losing interest and other such things. Interest in Krishna consciousness. And for time to spend for it, energy to spend on it, because I'm interested in it. And then your time, the energy spent on it, will beget it and cause it to grow. What else?
I keep stumbling on something and I can't quite put my finger on. Some statements seem to say that we should preach out of overflow, like you said, especially in the context of bhakti, because we're people who are in love, so we just talk about what makes us tick, and it's that kind of overflow. If somebody talks about God or says something accurate, they show some interest, and we share that. But then you just mentioned the example of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur or Haridasa Nityananda were proselytizing. They were going after people, and that's probably the blind spot I had. I still can't quite grasp it. Which is it?
Well, I think that that it's both. Both are really the same, and the idea being that if you're involved in bhakti, you're excited about it, and you want to share it, and you're going to share in proportion to that which you have. Compassion is certainly the quality of the Vaishnavas, and so they are naturally inspired to share. So if we can hone that compassion that characterizes the Vaishnava Vanshakalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhyevacha, then and cultivate that compassion. I think maybe that's the way to look at it. You could say overflow as opposed to proselytization, but I don't think that bhakti is without any overflow. And this is how to use how to deal with the overflow. The overflow causes some interest in sharing. I mean, nobody's, what is it? No man, no woman is an island, something like that. So, what we're about, we naturally share. Now, that said, okay, that's one thing. You're an individual, but then, yes, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur formed a mission, and he looked at Western Christian missionaries advocating Christianity, and he thought, let's do the same thing with Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's teaching. Let's share it. So a great person in their tradition had insight coming from Bhakti Vinod to share it with the world, as Mahaprabhu felt, as expressed in the core text, it should be distributed everywhere. Mahaprabhu says, how can I take advantage of all these fruits myself? I need help, more people. So we need to distribute the fruits. So it's there, the idea of sharing, of proselytization, I guess you could say, to some extent, but then it has to be done in such a way that you're actually sharing in a way that constitutes the sharing of your own, at your own level of realization and so forth. One shouldn't speak beyond their realization. But yeah, there is a difference between just this kind of overflowing and systematically trying to propagate. But I think in the case of Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's idea was, look, use your mind and your intelligence to think of ways to explain this great teaching to others and share it to others. That will consume your mind more than if you go and sit in the jungle and just try to chant. Understand what it's about, think about it, try to explain it, put it in your own language, and that will be helpful for you personally as a devotee, and it will be helpful for others. It's said you chant it quietly, it's good for you, chant out loud, others may hear. So, really, in a sense, the outreach advocated by Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur one way to think about it is, may look like an outreach to give it to the whole world, and it is, but in the context of that, it's to give it to yourself. That you do kirtan, and it would be good for you. And this is a way of doing kirtan that's very consuming. Before you have taste for Nam, to speak about the teachings, and then think, how am I going to explain that? Cause you to look more closely at the teachings, what the implications are, and so forth. And so one becomes absorbed. So it's, in one sense, we're doing kirtan for ourselves, for our own progress. Does that help?
That part is clear, but then it stumbles into the initial statement of my path is perfect for me. And if everybody's path is perfect for them,
Well, materialistic path is not perfect for anybody. If you're on a path toward Brahman or Paramatma, in his many forms, or Bhagawan, that's one thing. But if you're on a path towards just sense indulgence and so forth, that's no path at all. So there's one thing to meet somebody who has a strong samskar for yoga, but most people only have a strong samskar for sense indulgence and materialistic pursuits. Not materialism maybe as a philosophy, they haven't thought about it like that, but in terms of consumerism, acquisition, and so forth. So, sheesh, you're going like, in a self-destructive mode. How can, a person who's realized that not want to share with them? So, now, that said, if they're already on a spiritual path or something, that's another thing. Prabhupada was very inclusive in that sense. He said, well, any name of God you chant is good, That's okay. You don't have to change your dress. It's all fine. Sometimes he would preach very broadly like that. Okay? All right. Shri Krishna Bhakti ki jai. Shri Daji Gopal ki jai. Or Bhakti Vrinda ki jai. Or Premanand.
Maharaj ki jai.
Jai.